Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Nick Lester-Davis. I'm here to chair this webinar today and to welcome you all. And indeed, I think we've got people from around the world coming to hear about this interesting topic of the deliveries in the post-COVID-19 world. We've heard an awful lot about how transport is to change. The government is pushing hard about reassigning road space in favour of cycling and walking in urban areas in particular, but we hear relatively little about the impact that this will have on freight and deliveries. And yet those of us who know something about the issues know how essential it is to get freight and deliveries right if we're going to get towns and cities working properly. Now, I'm really pleased that we have got three very good speakers here today. Natalie Chapman, who's the head of urban policy from Logistics UK, Sarah Randall, who's the head of parking services at Croydon Council, and Neil Harren, who's the founder and CEO of Grid Smarter Cities. They've all got very important contributions to make, and we'll be interested to hear their comments very shortly. Just before we start, can I remind you that on your dashboard you've got a space for questions. At the end of the session we've got about 30 minutes for questions and answers, so if you want to ask any questions, particularly if you can tell us who they're directed to, please put them in the question box and we will get to those as we can. After each presentation, I will ask the speakers a couple of questions too, and that may help prompt some more from you. So with no further ado, can I pass over to Natalie Chapman, Head of Urban Policy in Logistics UK. Natalie, over to you.
Thanks, Nick. Good morning, everyone. So move on to the next slide. So I think Nick's already given me an introduction, so move on to the slide after that. Okay, so I thought it'd just be useful to start off by explaining who Logistics UK is, because many of you may not have heard of us before, but we are not a new organisation. You may have heard of our previous name, which is FTA, the Freight Transport Association, and a couple of weeks ago we renamed to Logistics UK. And really, the reason behind this is to reflect the fact that we represent all of logistics. So whilst road freight is and remains core to what a lot of our members do, actually it's the end-to-end supply chain that we also represent as well. So do forgive me if I slip back and refer to ourselves as FTA throughout this. I've been here 17 years. The name change only happened 2 weeks ago, so it's all taking a little bit of getting used to. But hopefully you'll hear sort of more from us in the future. So if we need to move on to the next slide. And I thought just put a bit of context about who we are and what we do. So we have just over 18,000 members, and our members operate, in terms of road freight, about half the UK HGV fleet, and about a third of the 4.6 million vans on the road. So quite a substantial proportion of the vehicles that are out there. As well as I said, we also represent logistics right across the various modes as well. So just move on to the next slide. So I thought it'd be good to just sort of outline sort of the role of logistics. Now, the fact that you've all joined a webinar about delivery shows that you realise that we actually are quite important to keeping our towns and cities moving. The logistics industry employs more than 2.6 million people and contributes about 130 billion to the nation's gross value add. But as well as our contribution to jobs and to the economy, logistics is something that plays a vital role in our everyday lives. And it's something that all too often I think we do take for granted. And the current crisis, particularly the fallout of panic buying at the very start of lockdown, shone a light on how vitally important logistics is to our everyday lives. We've been, of course, saying this for years, but it was really great to hear people, to hear politicians, and to hear the press saying that, you know, delivery drivers were essential workers, were heroes. And in fact, it goes way beyond that, because there's a whole a range of people working behind the scenes in logistics to keep the supply chain moving, who are all playing that really crucial role. But I think it's really important that logistics isn't just seen as a type of transport user. Yes, we operate vehicles, but actually we're part of essential infrastructure. So we're here to serve the rest of the economy and the people. You know, we don't move stuff just for the sake of it. Believe me, it's far too expensive to do that. We move things because someone somewhere ordered it. And when we take the rubbish away, it's because someone somewhere created it. And as our population grows, so does our demand for goods and servicing. So therefore, when we're building more new communities, as well as considering how we incorporate gas, electricity, water, broadband, public transport, schools and hospitals, it's also important that we think about what are the logistics needs for these new communities as well in these new developments. And it's much, much better if we can design things in from the beginning, because much of what we're going to be going on and talking about is dealing with the fallout of the fact that logistics hasn't been considered from the outset. So we're having to deal with how we manage the fallout, how we manage our curbside to the best that we can. So we need to be thinking about logistics as part of infrastructure, and if we do have the opportunity for new developments or big kind of wholesale changes to our high street, is thinking actually, are there ways in which we can help logistics be even more efficient and lessen the impact on the environment, improve safety and all of those things. So we move on to the next slide. But we also need to be thinking not just about the here and now and the kind of the environment that we inherit, but also what does that future look like? What will be our future buying habits? What are going to be those next big disruptors? You know, we've had Amazon, we've had Uber, we've had COVID crisis, we've had all sorts of things that have fundamentally changed lots of different ways that we do things. And what will be, so what will be that kind of effect on our demand for logistics and also, of course, on personal travel as well? What we have seen during lockdown is a huge accelerated growth in online shopping, and much of that is expected to stick. It was already an upward trajectory anyway, but it was very much accelerated by the fact that people couldn't get out to the high street, the fact that people were in many cases working from home, or in some cases having to shield or self-isolate as well. But we also need to be thinking about, what do the vehicles of the future look like as we move towards zero emission technologies to more automation, and how will our roads need to adapt? How will our high streets adapt? And I think that's going to be some quite exciting things to come in the future. And if we move on to the next slide. So our roads have lots and lots of different functions for different users depending on location and the time of day. And these competing desires and demands are often quite difficult to reconcile. I have lots and lots of sympathy for our sort of transport planners, and I know there's many of you that are watching that have a really, really tough job to do with so many different competing demands, and everybody waving their hand saying, hey, we're the most important thing, you need to make space for us. And in urban environments in particular, of course, there's a real push to make roads not just about travel, but also give that sense of place as well. But I think all too often the focus is around how people move about, and logistics is at best an afterthought. But of course, we can't have that cafe culture without the coffee beans. So ensuring that we get the stock in, that we remove the waste away, is hugely important to the success of really vibrant and exciting places to live and to spend time. And we're starting to see this right now with the schemes to reallocate road space in our towns and cities. Now, these are partly to encourage, of course, more active travel, more walking and cycling, particularly as space on public transport is limited, to be able to do that in social distance. But also to make sure that we have space on our streets for people to social distance as well. So we're starting to see more and more of these schemes come through. Many of them are being put through with temporary or experimental TROs, but we fully expect that many of these schemes will become permanent, albeit they may well need a fair amount of changes. And at Logistics UK, we absolutely support the aim behind these schemes. I mean, it's great to get more people being active. And of course, you know, from our point of view, if everybody jumped into their cars because they didn't want to get on public transport, there wasn't the capacity of public transport, we would have a real capacity issue on our roads, which of course would affect our ability to service our towns and cities. So whilst we absolutely support those aims, we also have, you know, some concerns as well, and it's making sure we know that the speed that some of these schemes have had to go in has been so fast that it's been quite difficult to properly plan out and consult beforehand. But what we are hoping is that the conversations we're having when we do have issues that we raise with local authorities is that we can get some changes made in a dynamic way. Because the biggest challenges we've got is access to the curbside, so we can still make deliveries, and ensuring that if we have less capacity on the roads, that we don't see a big increase in journey times, because otherwise, with fixed shifts and fixed amount of stuff to deliver, there is a risk that we may end up having to put more vehicles on the road because we have reduced productivity. So we end up dealing with a congestion problem by adding to it, which is something that no one wants. Clearly, it'll cost us more, but you know, the impact that will have on emissions and just say the look and feel of our towns and cities as well is something I think that none of us want. So the exam questions that I was asked for today's webinar were about the roles of pricing, regulating use and permitting access. So pricing is a really interesting one, and longer term actually we are going to have to really think about transport taxation. Particularly as we shift more towards more zero emission vehicles, and of course the tax receipts from fuel duty and vehicle excise duty decline. But this is about reopening, you know, a national debate, which I think I recall last time didn't go particularly well. But that said, the world has changed, and so the question is, what is the appetite now from people, from the public? You know, would it be viewed differently? Have those thoughts sort of changed on road pricing? And I think our concerns potentially could be that if we end up with lots of individual charging schemes, a bit like with the clean air zones, because even with a national framework in place, there is the potential for a patchwork of schemes and fragmented regulation. So logistics operates across boundaries. We know no boundaries. We'll go everywhere and anywhere. So from an administration point of view, it has the potential to be really problematic. But in theory, a national scheme could operate dynamically, taking into account the type of road or location, the time of day, the emissions levels of the vehicle, and of course the economic or social value of the journey as well. So obviously in London, we had a congestion charge for many years. That's sort of, you know, the kind of original road pricing scheme we've had in the UK. And I think certainly to some extent it has really been successful in reducing congestion, although I think at times it has faced sort of real challenges with just huge amounts of demand and say changing types of users on our roads as well. But it is a blanket tool, so it applies to logistics vehicles equally as it applies to private cars, for example. So what we really need to have in place is some alternative options. So, for example, the ability to remode or retime. So there is some ability to perhaps remode freight. So in some of our cities we have some wonderful rivers, so we can use some of those to shift some freight to the river. It is always going to be a fairly niche activity, in that the majority of freight is still going to have to be carried by road, and unless your delivery point is by the river, at some point it may need to be transferred to some kind of road vehicle. Again, you know, lots more potential for rail freight, particularly on the longer haul routes. And you know, and of course, lots of talk about, you know, what's the role for some micro mobility vehicles, for cargo bikes, for example. And again, they all have a role to play. But what we need to understand is that the majority, you know, our cities need thousands of tons of goods delivered every day. And so how do we get the bulk of stuff in? And actually that's about using, you know, the largest, although size appropriate vehicle for the streets that we're using, fully laden, nice and quiet, and getting as much of that in ideally overnight. So it's about what are those alternative options. So again, retiming deliveries is something that I think we need to be looking a lot more at. When we've got limited capacity to build new roads, we need to think, how can we maximise that current capacity that we, or the current sort of network that we have, and make its fullest use. You know, not everything can be retimed, and we get that, and there are some locations that are going to be far too sensitive, but we do need to look at that. But in terms of road pricing, you know, we need to have some alternatives in place. You know, otherwise it's simply a tax, and revenue raising isn't necessarily a bad thing. But we need to be honest, if that's what it is about. It is, though, a harder sell, I think, to people if they can't see those direct benefits. In terms of regulating use, well, can we consider restricting certain uses of the kerb to certain times of day? We already have that to an extent with signs and lines, but it's important that at certain times we prioritise different traffic flows. So busy times of day, that we look at looking at our arterial routes and about making sure we're prioritising sort of traffic flow, and then on certain other roads, perhaps enabling more that sense of place. So we're seeing that in parts of our cities where we're enabling more kind of outdoor dining for hospitality as that sector starts to reopen. But we also need to think about sort of how we manage sort of time at the curbside as well. So solutions that may be aimed at private cars, you might want quite a fast turnover at the curbside of private cars, if indeed you want private cars there at all. But the delivery takes, as long as the delivery takes to be made safely. So sometimes we see restrictions of 20 minutes, which is extremely challenging to make some deliveries within that time. And finally, on permitting access, I think rather than just thinking about when we don't want vehicles on our roads by adding further restrictions, regulations, we need to consider how best to enable deliveries and servicing activity. So as I mentioned, looking at retiming. So how can we make better use of the shoulders of the day or overnight? Clearly during sensitive hours, we need to make sure the delivery can be quiet enough, but there's lots and lots of fantastic technology out there, as well as behaviour change. And I worked with Transport for London in developing a code of practice on retiming deliveries as well, which, whilst developed in London, applies across the rest of the country too. So don't go and reinvent the wheel, go and have a look on the TfL website for that. But if the case is that some locations are too sensitive, then there needs to be a bit of a trade-off. We need to make sure that every location has a legal loading solution, not just commercial premises, but deliveries to homes too. And it's about balancing up any conflicting restrictions, such as loading and parking restrictions, alongside things like planning restrictions and delivery access. So I'm going to leave that there for a moment, because I think I've possibly gone over my 8 minutes. Sorry, Nick, and bring it back in for questions.
Thank you very much, Natalie. I'm just going to ask you a couple of questions before we move on to Sarah. One thing you didn't mention was the possibility of having more distribution hubs, particularly to move to micro-mobility or smaller vehicles, which will be more suitable for places where pavements have been widened and on-street activities are taking place. Is this a goer, do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question, Nick, and thanks, Rosa, because there's only so much that you can squeeze into a few minutes. Yes, and a lot of our members are looking at sort of that last mile and shifting to those kind of micro-mobility vehicles, so small electric vehicles, cargo bikes, or even making deliveries on foot, particularly in those kind of really dense urban environments. But of course, if you're going to enable that to happen, we need the land to do that. And they don't even need to be incredibly large sites. But one of the big challenges we have in logistics is safeguarding land, because once it's gone forever. And the challenge, of course, with land values is they always have high value for other uses. So it's about sort of safeguarding and preserving. What I would say, and I think I said earlier, is, you know, our cities need, you know, thousands of tons of goods each day. So though this is about a last mile solution, this is not about how you bring the bulk of stuff in. And I think there's no silver bullet. It's about how you bring it in as part of the mix of a really good logistics system within our cities.
But as we've seen in terms of passenger transport, where there's now an acceptance that there never used to be, that people are going to have to use blends of different modes and different types of transport in the future. It's no longer taking the car and doing every journey by car. Is this now going to happen in the freight world as well, that it's no longer just a question of getting a 44-tonner and using that to do all your freight needs, even if it can be nice and quiet, which I think lots of people would question about, but that in future freight, as with passengers, is going to have to be done with a blend of transport?
Yeah, and I think freight's always been a little bit, we've always looked at kind of a variety of different modes and how things kind of interlink. And I think even more so with other challenges, with other restrictions and challenges we've got, particularly in our towns and city centres, we need to think about how the whole system works together. We're not talking necessarily about 44-ton trucks making the final mile delivery to a high street or to someone's home necessarily. They are great for the trunking work, if indeed you can't use rail freight for some of those routes. But I think there still is going to be a need for those larger vehicles going in. What you don't want to be doing, for example, is breaking down a fully laden supermarket truck that's going to come in and make one delivery to a store to lots of small vehicles. You'll be replacing a medium-sized truck with 10 vans, and you replace 10 vans is about the carrying capacity of about 8 to 10 cargo bikes. So if you're looking at actual sheer payload, the larger vehicles will help you with that, and if indeed they are appropriate in size and we can make them quiet enough as well, which there's plenty of technology to do that. It's about how you kind of bring in the mix and the blend of vehicles to make that delivery and make it as efficient as possible. One thing you don't want to do too much is be adding too many additional links into the supply chain, because that in itself adds cost. So you've got to ask at all of the stages, what's the business case, who's going to pay for it, how will it work?
Smashing. Thank you very much, Natalie. I'm now going to pass on to Sarah Randall, who is the head of parking services for Croydon Council, and she has the responsibility for actually managing the curbside in a very important major centre. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Sarah. I work for the London Borough of Croydon, and I'm going to try and talk to you a little bit about some practical examples of what we've done in Croydon recently and some of the challenges that we feel that we're going to have. Next slide, please. The supply chain is evolving. Parking and road use has changed dramatically over the last 6 months and within that 6 months. So it has been a challenge from a parking perspective. Demand around hospitals initially was exceptionally high, particularly for staff members, and making sure we could provide suitable access for them. And also with a lot more people working from home and therefore not moving their vehicles, how do we manage that curbside? And what we've noticed is, particularly in areas of high density residential, an increasing in demand for more parking and the impact that has on everything. Then looking at that from a retail delivery perspective, customers' expectations on that last mile delivery have increased, so that people are now expecting an increase in that in the timeframes in which things are delivered. People aren't happy to wait for that delivery, which then puts even more pressure on the distributors to deliver it at a fast rate. One of the other things we're noticing with curb space demand is an increasing ownership of cars, which was occurring anyway, and I think will be very interesting to see what happens post-COVID and the effects of that. Within Croydon, we've been trying really hard to look at how we make our policies a little bit greener, cleaner, and try and nudge theory residents into that. We've done a number of different things with emissions-based permits, and looking at, we're about to roll out emissions-based pay and display, which I know a number of other London local authorities have done. So how do we nudge people into the correct place? Next slide, please. When we're looking at, and I know Natalie touched on this as well, the impact of COVID in terms of people preferring to shop online versus going to high streets, that's had a massive impact on where demand is for deliveries. So we're noticing in our district centres, particularly in the centre of Croydon, demand has gone down, whereas in our local district centres, so Selsdon, Thornton Heath, Norbury, Coulsdon, demand has gone up. So it's how we as an authority manage all of that. We've done a number of things. So when we're looking at reallocating of road space, we've introduced, I'm going to call them parklets, so little restaurants in parking bays along our south end, which is our restaurant quarter, and seeing to help support businesses in ensuring they're doing their social distancing, and seeing what impact that has. But there's also, that could be seen as very positive. There are some businesses who see that as quite negative, that they're now losing curb space to what they're doing. So the impact on that, and then from a local authority, if we block out lots of curb space for parklets, etc., the impact that has on income to the local authority, when at the moment people's budgets are probably pushed quite hard. The other thing that I'm going to talk about is the impact on the way in which people are ordering, particularly food and drink. So we've seen a massive increase in Deliveroo and Uber Eats drivers and their ability to park close by to whichever venue they are collecting their food from, and the impact that has on the environment. So one of the things we're trying to work on at the moment is I've just made contact with Uber Eats and Deliveroo to see how we work with them to encourage drivers not to pull up onto the pavements right outside some of these establishments, because that then creates problems with social distancing coming past, and aesthetically doesn't look particularly pleasing when you can get up to 20-30 moped drivers in a very small place. I've already talked about the fact that within Croydon we are looking at greener emission policies. So we've done emissions permits, and we're just about to roll out emissions-based pay and display. One of the things we've knocked around and talked a lot about is about timing around demand, and whether or not within the policies we have, whether or not you could change the way in which you charge or manage parking or delivering on street in order to make timings particularly. I know Natalie talked about some of this earlier, about how do we manage that curb space to ensure that we have deliveries, we keep the traffic moving during peak times, although peak times have changed dramatically with more people working from home, but to still allow businesses to take the deliveries that they want. Next slide, please. Then we start to look at some of the other things we're starting to look to introduce. So school streets within Croydon, we're in our phase 3 of introducing school streets. We currently already have 17 school streets, and we're introducing another 10 come September. This probably causes an issue for that end delivery, because within our school streets, deliveries aren't allowed to take place between the times the roads are made pedestrianised, which creates 4-hour gaps in the day where residents in those streets cannot get deliveries. Although you could argue on the other side that they couldn't get deliveries during those times anyway, because the roads were blocked with people dropping off children, and the impact that has. And when you look at most of the schools that we've introduced our school streets to, of an average over all of them, I think I'm probably safe to say that 75% of all new emissions lives in under a 15-minute turnaround. Probably 15 to 17-minute walk from school based on Transport for London walking speeds, which actually, if we can stop people doing that, how can we change other things that they're doing? The other challenge for local authorities is we have an increase in population density and the number of car-free developments, but those developments still need, or increasingly needing, more home deliveries, and don't have the facility of driveways or parking spots for those home deliveries to stop in. How, as a local authority, do we help manage that demand for curb space to best serve the local environment? We then look at CPZ designs, and actually the way in which you introduce CPZs are around getting your residents within Croydon to petition to manage, and quite often we end up with maximising resident space because that's the way you get them in. But does that maximise the actual demand for things? So one of the things we've realised is if you try and put a delivery bay out, no one wants it outside their home. Everyone would like one, but just not outside their home, because everyone sees the space outside their house as their car space. So it's how we look at that. And then we're starting to think about, actually, there are the click and collects and lockers and warehouses which will start to alleviate this, but where will we go moving forward? Will we get robot couriers or drones, and what kind of space will they need? One of the things I know that Natalie was talking about was the fact that actually real estate and assets for parking versus residential and other business use always comes lower down the priority list. We're not as valuable, but at the same time, without it, you don't have that vibrant community and the impact that that will have on everything that we do. And then going back up to some of that, we're starting to try and introduce low traffic neighbourhoods, and we've had a number of road closures, which for the residents that live in them have gone down remarkably well and have received an amazing amount of positivity. However, the residents that live just outside them or on the main roads, which are now becoming more congested, are finding them remarkably challenging, are less supporting of them. So it's how do you manage the conflicting demands of different groups of residents and what we're doing. Next slide, please. Oh, no, sorry, can I get you to go back one? Highlights. How do we move forward and what can we do? I think what we need to do is look at how we prioritise the ever-changing road use, and I don't think there is one answer that fits every location, and it's how we manage that moving forward. I think loading space as we move post the COVID recovery will change dramatically, and looking at how we try and support businesses so that we are working with them to make it timely and efficient. So some of the things we've talked about is how do we allocate road space that's time specific to help free up that delivery time. How do we look at the traffic management orders, which when put down you have the yellow lines and loading restrictions that are set in stone. Do they need to be set in stone for 24 hours, or could they be flexible, so you have tiered restrictions, particularly to facilitate deliveries? I'm also conscious that I have a number of locations where we have loading restrictions because of the number of and the impact that has with blue badge holders who can park on double yellow lines, but actually you then sometimes put loading restrictions in. What impact does that have on the business that's right outside? How do we facilitate both those groups to make sure we provide accessibility for blue badge holders whilst also maintaining the road traffic flow and allowing the businesses along that stretch to get deliveries? We have been working, so when I look at what we've been doing in terms of our construction logistic plans at the moment, because there's a huge amount of development going on in Croydon, and we've been working with building sites specifically and created parking bays so that we have holding bays so they can do just-in-time deliveries, which has worked really well, but it's making sure we allocate the right level of road space to deliver that so that we don't tie up towns with where they are. And then looking at the uncertainties within the high street, one of the advantages to the high street is people in general can walk there more, and it's far more sustainable. And what will happen, one of the big pushes is to shop local. What will the impact of COVID have on little local shops? Because I look at my local high street in Caterham, and some of the more independent shops seem to be thriving at the moment, whereas the multi-retailers that you see in district centres like Debenhams and M&S and John Lewis all seem to be struggling. So what impact and what changes will we have, and where will that leave us? the other things we probably need to consider is how do we make more space for that sustainability around bicycle hangers and scooter operators with the Uber Eats and the Deliveroo, and make sure that we deliver all of that. Next slide, please. I think from a local authority point of view, our challenge is how do we balance everyone's demand with an increase in car load and a reduction in the space we have on high streets to deliver the best for everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Sarah. I've got a couple of questions for you. Before I ask them, can I just remind everybody who's listening into this webinar that you can ask questions too by putting your questions in the question box, and we'll come to all of those questions after our third speaker. But just for you, Sarah, a couple of points. Firstly, you mentioned that in reallocating curb space to parklets and things like this, that you had some issues from businesses who were worried about losing short stay parking outside them. I wonder if you have a view as to how much this is a real problem, and we know it is a real problem in some cases, or how much it is just a perception problem. I remember very much the very first red route that was put in. The biggest outcry about losing short stay parking was from a shop which turned out to be selling antique marble fireplaces. And we all thought, oh yes, this is something you just do. I'm just going to pop in and buy an antique marble fireplace. So sometimes the perception of the loss of parking space is more than the reality. Do you have a view on that?
I probably would agree with you. I think sometimes the perception does outweigh the reality, so I'm quite often in favour of experimental traffic management orders rather than standard traffic management orders, because I think sometimes when people see the impact of something in action, they change their opinions versus the thought of what's going to happen, which was played out very clearly when we first introduced school streets. So I think that has an impact. I also think the value you associate to parking, for me, free parking is one of those things that's always undervalued. So where we've got in our district centres, it was a manifesto pledged by our current administration to have 1 hour free parking. I think that undervalues that asset, and therefore when you take it away, people are getting concerned about the impact it has on parking rather than it actually having an impact on the businesses that it directly affects.
No. The other thing I was going to raise with you is a point that Natalie mentioned in terms of retiming deliveries. And we know that the logistics industry has been interested in nighttime deliveries for many, many years. But at the same time, we know that many businesses would find nighttime deliveries a problem because they're not staffed up overnight. Do you have any sort of feeling about that?
Whether it's so, my thoughts were probably around, my understanding was not so much around nighttime deliveries, was around actually if you have curb space between 7 AM and 7 PM. I know that certain patches of road are going to be busy between 7 and 9:30, at which time the traffic flow dies down, but they then start to get busy again at 3 o'clock. So how can we work with the freight industry to ensure we get deliveries during those times, so that we maximise that transport flow, and look at how we do that, whether that's during the middle of the day when we have less traffic or overnight. Doesn't affect me. I think it's valuing that curb space so that if there was a cost difference between the two, people then have a different impact on the decision making they make. So my prime examples are around Sainsbury's and how they do deliveries, but yeah.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm sure we'll come back to you with questions at the end, but I'd now like to move on to Neil Harren, who's Chief Executive of Grid Smarter Parking. Neil's actually had some real proposals that are now coming into play, and we'd be very interested to hear about them. Nick.
Morning, Nick, and good morning, everyone. And I'd just like to introduce from Grid Smarter Cities. We're a Newcastle-based company, and we've developed a proposition called Kerb. simple way to manage curb space in the cities. Next slide, please. So the mission is to take the complexity of the curb space and make it more accessible, more easily to be used by commercial freight operators and managed by the city. And we're developing a software platform that allows the commercial vehicles to access that curb space and allows cities to manage that curb space. Next slide, please. So there are many pressures, many challenges. Air quality is a big driver at the moment in many cities and increasingly so in many congested urban areas. Congestion is a problem. Accessibility, access to the curb space is an issue. More and more people, more and more cars, growing competition for access to the curb. And it's the most underutilized piece of real estate and under-monetized piece of real estate that the city has. And we want to look and see how we can better manage it. Next slide, please. So the pressure and demands on the curb. So goods delivery vehicles, parking spaces, pick up and drop offs for fast food, bike lanes, EV charging, multimodal mobility, drop off zones, etc., etc., etc. There's a lot of demand on the curb space, and the allocation for that curb space can be prioritised and determined by the city based on local priorities, and really take a granular approach to that curb space and look at a new way of doing things. Next slide, please. So what we're looking at building here, it's the curb product suite, which is a platform, which allows local authorities to manage that curb space. From a curb delivery perspective, we're looking at various ways of managing the curb space, whether that be the bookable loading bay or a virtual loading bay. As Sarah mentioned, there are some areas where restrictions are put in and loading is prohibited, but we can create effectively virtual loading bays with opportunity windows where we can lift that restriction for certain vehicles at certain times of the day to better access the curb space. And then you start looking at the types of zonal permits. Natalie mentioned sometimes a 20-minute delivery period is not long enough. If we want to encourage vehicles to dwell longer, to stop circling and stopping and dropping and delivering parcels that way, we can look at zonal permits and the way they're used. The curb construction element, we looked at the construction freight industry and the issues that was arising from that. Some of the problems were circling vehicles, vehicle turning up the site well in advance of their delivery and allocated slots, just to be there, just so that they didn't get penalised for being late. So if we take a construction site and look at that, like an airport, we can create holding areas, we can create landing slots, and tying in with construction logistics plans that some developers have to adhere to. We look at the prescribed routes and working backward from origin to destination and how best that vehicle make the journey and access the curb space and just become a little bit more efficient. It's important as well that the application that we're developing links into enforcement, so that tickets are not issued when someone has a booking and a permit, but we have a zero tolerance approach to the curb space as well for rogue vehicles that are not adhering to the rules. And really what local authorities are going to need as well is the curb control, which is the ability to monitor all of these behaviours in real time and historically, to see patterns, to look at where best to manage the curb space and how best to go forward, because we have to take a granular approach. Each local authority's high street and curb space is different needs, different users, and the engagement with businesses is key and important as well. Next slide, please. So we've got pilots and projects underway at the moment. The one in Southwark, we're looking at a physical bay, which is becoming a permit-only bay, and we're in consultation with the local businesses to see what best suits and what best fits them, and then working with the third-party logistics and the delivery companies to see what would work for them as well. So it's about taking an approach, bringing in the stakeholders, and identifying what best solution fits for the local community as well. Croydon, we've mentioned the freight traffic control platform that we're building there, and that's working on a very, very busy site operating on Addiscombe Road, which has the added issue of a tram running past every 3 minutes. So it's about getting vehicles to holding areas. The banksman can then see the vehicles in the holding areas and draw them from site. Sorry, draw them to the site from the holding area. Smart Dublin, we're picking back up again with Dublin post-COVID, and we're looking at smart loading zones, virtual loading zones, and zonal permits there, and the ability for vehicles to book curb space and well longer than the permitted periods if they're bigger loads than normal. What we saw in the pilot in Sunderland with one of the parcel couriers, instead of that vehicle doing stop drop around the city, it was allowed to dwell for longer than the permitted observation period for enforcement, in an area where loading was prohibited, but where we could open up the opportunity window, and that vehicle was there for, in some instances, 90 minutes, a couple of hours, and doing the deliveries on foot. So we're taking circling vehicles out and having a static, what effectively is a micro depot. Next slide, please. So it's important as we move forward that cities work together, they work with the construction industry, the freight industry, the businesses, and you can manage and better monetize the existing infrastructure. And I do apologize for the incorrect spelling of kerb there, but we are working with companies and cities in the States who have similar problems. And I've traveled the world over the last 18 months to 2 years, and the same problems exist in every city, in every part of the world. So it's important that we try and pull all of this together to better manage cities and better manage the kerb space. And the commercial operators, I originally started life working with some of the big fleets who were getting millions of pounds worth of parking tickets a year. And there was always going to be a better way to manage the kerb space. And certain vehicles need particular access to the kerb space as well. It's going to be very difficult to transfer 70 kilogram and 120 kilogram beer kegs to any other form of transport. So those bigger delivery vehicles have to be right outside the job. The Tesco's and the Sainsbury's, to get their deliveries to store, they need big trucks to be right outside the store and to be able to be in and out as quickly and efficiently as possible. And if we're looking at the construction logistics plans and delivery management solutions as well, then we need to work through integrating solutions such as we're developing into construction logistics plans so we can better manage the kerb space and better manage the operator's access to the kerb space. And the benefits for the community, if we can reduce congestion, reduce the number of vehicles circling, reduce the congested kerb space, we create improvements in air quality, safer streets, and we've got to be flexible to the local needs as well. And we take the businesses, the operators, and the city on the journey as well. And it's important that we can build a platform that cooperates and collaborates with everybody else. Next slide, please. And that's us. And would really like some questions. We want to be challenged over the way forward. But I think what we're looking at is if we're treating the kerb space as a flexible piece of real estate, flexible and dynamic and can be managed, then we have all of the regulatory and policy issues that have to be overcome. But if we're moving towards the world of connected and autonomous vehicles, digitized kerb space, we're going to need a new way of looking at it, a new way of signing it, and that double yellow line with the upright sign is going to be a thing of the past. In 5 and 10 years' time, we're going to say, why didn't we do this a long time ago? So that's me, Nick.
Thank you very much, Neil. It's fascinating to see some innovative thinking coming into this. I appreciate that a lot of the projects that you're working on are still only at the design stage, but you've had some real experience in Dublin. Could you just tell us what you found, the key findings and the key benefits from Dublin have been so far?
We're moving from a phase 1 approach to a phase 2, and what we're looking at is identifying the areas where there are critical problems. Around the Temple Bar area in Dublin, it's a very, very congested area, so we're looking at allocating some of the kerb space for specific vehicles at certain times. So we're moving to the ability to use the booking platform to create the bays, looking at digitizing that as well, building it into the app, and then the operators can start using the app in anger to access the kerb space and deliver without getting penalties. That's about prioritizing the kerb space and integrating it into enforcement.
I appreciate that's the plan, but what's the actual experience that you've had so far?
We're not at the delivery stage yet. We're just onboarding the operators in Dublin. We're allocating the kerb space, so we are moving to the next phase. Sunderland was the one where we had the actual experience of an operator using the application and showing the benefits and gains that they made from using it.
One of the issues that has arisen in terms of booking delivery spots in particular, and this was found in Barcelona, which was one of the first cities that tried to do this some years ago, was that unlike planes or trains, where you could reasonably ensure that people arrived round about the time that their slot was booked for road freight, that's much more difficult. And if you've got somebody who's booked a slot for, say, 10 o'clock to 10:30 for delivery, but because of traffic they only arrive at 25 past 10, and the 10:30 delivery has arrived 5 minutes earlier and has already started to unload, how do you manage things like that?
You build in a lot of contingency in the early days until you can have more granularity of routing and scheduling and integration with the actual slot. So you would have 50% capacity. So you'd have the capacity for 2 vehicles to be there at the same time, but you'd only allocate a slot for one of them at one particular time. And the flexibility to create zones around the actual physical permit bay and virtual loading zones, so you have an alternative. And we can create holding areas as well adjacent to the areas where you want to draw vehicles in the curb space. So it's about having the flexibility in the system to accommodate exactly what you've mentioned, which is vehicles not arriving on time, rogue vehicles being in the location, how you integrate that with enforcement. So there's no one-size-fits-all solution. This is about the integration of building blocks and components of curbside management and taking the commercial freight operators and the city on the journey as well.
But isn't that going to lead to lots of arguments on the street? You know, I got here first, no, but my time was here first, and having vehicles blocking up or circling around, waiting for spaces when you're really trying to avoid all that.
Yes, it's about better management, and there are plenty of arguments that used to go on the curbside when there was no regulation. So we have to move towards some form of flexible management and some form of ability to book the space, or the ability to flexibly manage that space to make it a variable loading bay at certain times of the day and be a drop-off zone at other times. So yes, the pilots that are going on in other areas around the world are looking at this as well, and it's something that has to be overcome.
One of the things you mentioned, and this has come up in one of the questions we've had from Kit Allwinter, was about how can booking of curb space comply with regulation? Aren't loading bays need to be open to all? And if we start charging for them, how does this work? How do we ensure access for all? Don't the current regulatory procedures have limits about how far we can go down this route?
Yes, and that's why building in the process of creating dynamic dispensations, you can create dispensations for vehicles to be curbside in areas where loading is prohibited. But it's a paper-based process, takes a number of days to do it. So what you're doing is, in that instance, creating pre-allocated areas, dispensations for certain types of vehicles. The locations have been risk assessed, and that will then effectively open up opportunity windows. If you want to create physical permit bays that are going to be able to be booked, you create a temporary or an experimental traffic order to do that. And eventually we're going to have to look at the whole of the local authority traffic order procedure and the way we sign and line the roads to make it more flexible, because the pressure on the curb space is not going to cease. It's going to be, the demand is going to be great, and it's going to increase all the time. So we're going to need to look at, as we move towards, like I said, digitizing the curb space and connected and autonomous vehicles, they will want to be able to interact with the curb space and guarantee slots. That's the only way we're going to move towards being more efficient in city centres.
Can I remind people at this point, if you do have any questions, please enter them into the questions box, because I'm going to move on to another question which relates to this, which is from John Carr, who assumes that servicing such as waste collection, electricity and gas is integrated into the scheme. But his real question is, if you are not somebody who's familiar with the need to book, and somebody just turns up and occupies a delivery space, how can you deal with this if they're just not aware of the fact that they needed to have booked in advance?
Yeah, we can do this, and this is where working with industry groups such as Natalie's means that we have to convey that information to as many people and as widely as possible. It's the same principle that was adopted in Westminster when they brought in pay-by-phone parking. It was done through information, education, and awareness, and an issuing of warning notices in the first instance to get people to comply.
Can I move on more generally to other areas, and really a question that's coming up for Natalie, I think, which is how can the logistics sector play its role in decarbonising transport?
Yeah, great question. And decarbonising particularly heavy transport has been something that's been quite notoriously difficult to do. I think on lighter vehicles, if we're looking at the vehicles themselves, I think lighter vehicles, I think that the understanding is we're going down the electric route with those. The biggest uncertainty is where we're going to be going with HGVs, because we still don't have a clear roadmap of which technology it is that we need to back. And what I say is that our members at Logistics UK are looking at this very closely. We have an environment working group which consists of some very, very forward-thinking operators who are trialling various technologies. One of the things that we are working with government on and really sort of trying to push for is to have a definition of an ultra-low emission truck. So we then have the certainty of what the technology is that we need to back, because businesses are willing to invest, but they want to make sure they're investing in the right technology. So, is that going to be, are we looking at, electric HGVs, catenary systems? Are we looking at hydrogen? Will it be one solution for trunking vehicles, for example, and perhaps something slightly different for vehicles that are going to urban areas? So for the larger vehicles, I think the jury's still a little bit out on the technology. There's various things that are available that we are very closely looking at. But what businesses want is that confidence to invest, to know they're investing in the right solution.
One of the issues that's risen up in the passenger sector in decarbonising is not just about making each mode more energy efficient or more carbon friendly, or indeed about changing mode, but just also in terms of people moving less. Is that an issue that the freight and logistics industry can take on board as well?
Well, absolutely. So we're all about efficient logistics. We have some, our members operate in very tight margins. So if you're not efficient, you're not going to stay in the game for very long. So it is all about how can we make things as efficient as possible. So that is looking at how can we increase productivity. And of course, one of the things we saw at the very start of lockdown was with fewer private cars on the road and other general traffic, because many of us were obviously having to heed the government's advice and stay at home and working from home, is actually for the parts of the freight industry that were continuing to operate, and of course not every part continued to operate depending on which part of the economy they served, but particularly those working in food retail and home deliveries, they saw productivity increase because there were fewer other vehicles on the road, so they could get from A to B a lot quicker. They could get so much more done in the day, reduced fuel usage, reduced emissions as well. So it is all about how can we be as efficient as possible, and work within kind of these changing environments that we're seeing, because we've got to work alongside the kind of the changing dynamic, the changing way that we're using our streets and our high streets.
I mean, it sort of prompts a question which Fraser Martin has raised, which is how do we promote only mile logistics to local businesses and help these businesses to do their own deliveries rather than expecting deliveries to come from further away?
So I think the supply chain is complex, and there is no one size fits all. So not everything is about delivering parcels. Our cities have all sorts of things. Neil mentioned beer. We have the waste collections that need to be taken away, huge amounts of construction. All their demands are going to be very different. And one thing that I'd also say, I feel that there's quite a lot of demonisation about online deliveries, and particularly the competition on the high street, and we need to be looking at what the future of the high street is, but also actually that online deliveries has a really, really important role to play for many businesses. So there are businesses, particularly some smaller businesses, that do have a bricks and mortar presence on a high street somewhere, but online enables them to really open up their marketplace, so they can now trade with the whole country, they can trade internationally. And you know, that can be a real game changer for, you know, for a lot of small businesses, not just the big businesses that we're used to buying from online as well.
One of the things that Neil mentioned, and I think this is a question for Sarah, was his parcel delivery company using a van as a sort of mobile warehouse, short stay warehouse in a city centre in Sunderland. Is this something, Sarah, that you think would work in Croydon? And if it could work, could you integrate that with micromobility as well? Have you got the space in Croydon Town Centre to do something like that?
Do I think it could work in Croydon? My answer would be yes. Do I think we have space at the moment? My answer would be no. So I'd say what we'd need to do is look at how we would facilitate that so that we attribute some road space to it, because I think it's a good idea. I think moving forward, these are the types of ideas that we need to be working on and seeing what works. I think a lot of the ideas that people have at the moment, until you actually see them in practice, you don't know how they're going to work and how much use they're going to have. But yes, definitely something we'd look at.
And this is one I picked up particularly because it's one of Neil's proposals that's actually been operated in practice, so he's seen the outcome, and that's always a big advantage.
No, definitely. I'm happy to have that conversation with Neil afterwards and see whether we can do it in Croydon, because I think it's a great idea.
Smashing. It's positive outcome of this seminar already. I wanted to pick up the other point that Natalie mentioned, which is home deliveries. And I wonder how much we are building into our planning that home deliveries are going to be much more common in the future. And firstly, are we building them into things like designs for car-free housing? Is home delivery built in? Is there an issue in low traffic neighbourhoods where we've got modal filters coming in that just makes the delivery schedule much harder to operate? Can I ask Sarah to start on that, particularly because you mentioned the problem with car-free developments, and then I'll ask Natalie about modal filters.
Yes, so one of the things I have increasingly been working on with is our strategic planning team and our strategic transport team and our planning team. So I was combining them into one team there, and looking at when they are signing off car-free developments or very low car developments, where are people going to get those deliveries? Because the likelihood is, or in my opinion, that you're going to get more people doing online food shopping and such like, and tying that into our policy around car clubs. So you try and have a combination of the two in one place rather than just going car free, and looking at how we deliver that so that actually for every number of residents you have, you start to think about delivery bays. The only problem, if I'm thinking that further through, is that unless you then start putting some time slots with regards to those deliveries, it becomes a free-for-all with those delivery bays. So I think actually not only do you need the delivery bays, but you also need some management of them to ensure that you do get the maximum use out of them.
And Natalie, has low traffic neighbourhoods really caused problems for home deliveries?
It's something we've been looking at very closely, Nick. I mean, the idea of the low traffic neighbourhoods is, you know, it's not a bad one, but obviously we've got lots of people continuing to not just work from home, but people that have to continue to self-isolate. So they need the delivery to come to them, to their door. What we'd say is we're keeping a close eye on it. We are asking our members to let us know and flag up if there are particular challenges. One of the things I think we all need to probably do as consumers is think about what we're ordering. So, for example, if we're ordering supermarket grocery deliveries, we will normally go and book a particular time slot. So we need to be thinking, actually, the time slot that we're booking, is that a realistic one? If we're living on a school street, for example, does that conflict with the time of the school streets? Equally, we know that our members are trying to get this information into their planning and scheduling software as well. But the challenge we've got is we've got so many of these schemes popping up all over the country, and many of them are under temporary TROs or experimental TROs, so they don't always filter into that usual kind of database of information that we've got. So there are, it leaves great potential for somebody just to go, I'll order something, and I've always called it a bit of the magic of the supply chain, because we order stuff and then it arrives like as if by magic. But actually, so we often don't think about how it's going to get to us, and perhaps we need to be making kind of more informed choices. So when we are making deliveries, when we know if we are able to schedule a time slot, we can't always do that depending on what we're ordering, but particularly with online groceries we can, is to be thinking about, are we putting in a realistic time slot for that delivery according to where I live?
I mean, what Sarah mentioned was possibly the need to have to go to manage time slots at delivery points as well. Is this just going to make scheduling absolutely impossible?
It has the potential to cause a real recipe for a real nightmare for that scheduling. But we've got to be thinking about how we do manage some of these sites. What we have seen from a lot of our members is actually they're getting a lot more PCNs from the private parking companies. A lot of the times when they're going and delivering to apartment blocks, for example, with their own off-road parking, but they haven't adequately designed in the needs for deliveries. And as we're doing more and more home deliveries, we're actually seeing those parking charges and those private parking companies really shoot up. So I think there's something we need to be doing in at the design stage to properly work this out and understand the different needs as well of deliveries. So there are some that it's not all groceries and parcels. Some of them will be about people moving home or delivering white goods and sofas and things as well.
One of the things, of course, people who get groceries delivered to home are now familiar with are that different times cost different amounts of money. And one of the issues that Sylvia Barrett has mentioned is, do we need to extend that concept to all sorts of different deliveries in order to make consumers much more aware of the costs of their deliveries, rather than just assuming that delivery is free and doesn't cost anybody anything?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point from Sylvia, and it's something that we've been saying for a long time. We're all obsessed with this notion of free delivery, and the reality is there is no such thing as free delivery. But by having something free, we therefore don't place a value on it. It's just like Sarah was saying earlier with the parking. If there is no charge for it, then we kind of undervalue things. And I'm not saying we do away with free delivery. Often that is an incentive to purchase from particular retailers. But as consumers, we quite often don't understand what is a green delivery. So Amazon, for example, now it still pops up if you've got Amazon Prime. Do you want it next day? But there is also an option of there's a no rush delivery, and there is a financial incentive, so you get £1 off your next purchase. You can also now bundle up your deliveries you can choose your Amazon delivery day. So if you tend to go on and order, a parcel here and a parcel there, throughout days of the week, you can bundle those together. And I think it's much more about thinking about how we do that. Now, part of that might be to use financial levers, but I think the first stage is just to understand what is seen as a green delivery and what isn't. But ultimately, even if we're armed with that information, if we're told to not use plastic carry bags, that's not great for the environment, and actually sometimes, unless there is a bit of a charge on this, then we might continue to do things. If particularly if nobody knows. So if we are told, oh, this is your green option, but actually nobody really knows what you're clicking on, then you'll just go for possibly what's most convenient. So I think if there are cost savings, which there quite often are, to more efficient deliveries, then I think might be ways of companies thinking about how we can share some of that with customers as well, and linking deliveries to other deliveries that are happening in that area, so ultimately we can reduce vehicle movements.
One of the other things that Sylvia has gone on to suggest is that the government might ban free deliveries or levy a tax on consumer deliveries, rather as they're doing on sugar and other things, so that it's only free to collect from a central point. How would that work?
I think that's actually quite a short-sighted solution, because I think online deliveries are being actually quite unfairly demonised. If it means that people aren't getting in their private car and driving somewhere, then it's not a bad thing. And particularly if we can group deliveries. So if you live in a rural area like I do, if you can be told that this is the best day to get your deliveries because we're already in that area and delivering lots of other deliveries, then that would be a good thing. There's two parts to this. One, I know there's a review at the moment on business rates and looking at what could be done for online sales to level up the high street. But I think the high street's got lots of other challenges, not so much just online deliveries, but I think there's lots of other challenges the high street has. And as I said earlier, there are lots of small businesses that have a high street presence, but also have an online presence. And so we shouldn't be demonising those companies. But also, I think that online shopping is being unfairly blamed for the rise in van traffic. And there's a really, really good report published a couple of years ago by Professor Alan Braithwaite, writing for the RAC Foundation, which actually said that 9 out of 10 vans on the road are actually service related, not delivery. So if we focus all of our efforts and say everything's about it's online shopping, we need to cut down on it. Actually, we're not solving the problem, could be creating other ones.
I think that's a very fair point. John Grantham has asked about neighbourhood logistics hubs, where groups of 5 or 10 households group together to consolidate orders. Sarah, do you think that that's actually a workable solution? Can it only work where people voluntarily get together and do that? Can the council have any role in trying to encourage that sort of behaviour?
I think it's an amazing idea, and I think actually probably working on that scale would work. I think working on a voluntary basis would work amazingly. Could a local authority get involved in trying? I think what the local authority could do is help signpost people to groups that have done it or how to do it. But in terms of administrating it, I don't think that would be where the local authority would want to position itself at the moment.
No, I was thinking of encouraging people to do it. So signposting and how-to toolkits could be the way forward.
I definitely think that's a way forward. When you look at, we've got neighbourhood champions in most areas, and they do a lot of stuff around green waste and other things like that. But actually, that's another thing they could look at. If you have 5-10 households that are grouped together, and you can stop 3 or 4 deliveries in that road in a given week period, actually it's your environment that you're affecting. So I do think that it would be a very positive thing.
Final question to all 3 of you is there anywhere, any city or town that you think over the last few months has got it really right or nearly right? Is there anywhere that has got it so badly wrong you can't wait for it to be taken away? Natalie, you've probably got more experience of this. Have you got a view on any of those?
I'll tell you where I think it's got it right, not necessarily all the solutions, but their approach to engagement. And there are, City of Westminster actually have been doing a huge amount of engagement with the industry on their changes to the roads, to the curb space, and particularly the reopening of hospitality that they've been doing. And whilst it's there are still challenges there, what I would say to any local authorities, please reach out to the businesses in your area, reach out to the logistics companies that supply them, and to ourselves, to Logistics UK, because we actually want, we've got lots of great ideas. We want to be part of the solution, and I think it's understanding everybody's kind of challenges and priorities and working out kind of what the best solutions are that we can do to kind of meet all of those. Notwithstanding, I know right now there's been huge pressures on local authorities to put in these schemes really, really quickly. So I think it's about, before things are put in permanently, please do come and talk to us, and not just by being a statutory consultee, but actually engagement which happens before the consultation, so you can make sure you're putting forward the strongest plan. So I think there's definitely probably a number of examples of authorities that get that really right. And I don't want to name and shame those that have got it wrong. We want to just make headway with them and work with them.
I appreciate it. I don't think anyone's naming and shaming, but it's always good to learn from mistakes. You learn more from mistakes than you do from getting it right.
Yeah.
Neil, you've been traveling the world, you say, where's got it absolutely right or nearly right, and where would you say we should look never to go near?
Well, the great one, which was just absolute chaos, was Shenzhen and Guangzhou when I went to China. How things ever got delivered with that amount of congestion, poor air quality, and chaos, I don't know. But what we're finding is that the city authorities and the local authorities in the UK are starting to wake up to, well, wait a minute, we can do something different. And it's about nudging behaviour. Big wholesale changes and big sticks being wielded isn't going to create the industry and the environment and the uptake that we need. And this is about nudging behaviour with an incentivised, carrot-driven approach. So local authorities are looking at different ways of doing things, and we're being funded to some degree by Innovate UK and some test and trial projects, which allows us to go testing, piloting, development, the pivot points where we can say we've got a proof point there. And then we move forward. We now need to move from where we are and then take the scale. And we've got multiple different verticals like construction, like parcel deliveries, food and beverage logistics, service and maintenance vehicles, all have different curbside needs and all different nuances of engagement. But there's a willingness out there with the local authorities to start trying this. And the operators, when they see the benefits, they want it everywhere.
And Sarah, where do you look to as somewhere to emulate and say that has done it well that you want to copy, or where do you look to say that's something we're not going to copy as far as Croydon's concerned?
I don't think I actually have specific examples, but we always look to see what experiences other local authorities have had so we can learn from them and try not to make the same mistakes and do it. We've had lots of conversations with local authorities at the moment around School Street and how we've done it and how other authorities are doing it to try and give them some of the lessons learned that we have so that we can try and improve everything for everyone moving forward. I think particularly within London there's a great network of authorities who are happy to ask for help and advice. I think most local authorities at the moment are just trying to do the best they can in an ever-changing envelope of demands.
Well, thank you all very much for that. I think we're just about coming to the end of our seminar now. Hope you've all enjoyed it. I thought that there was a lot of very interesting ideas and some very positive coming out of this. And I hope that it means that we don't underestimate the importance of deliveries and freight, as has happened so much in the past. The one big thing that or two big things I'd draw out of this, as far as I'm concerned, is firstly the importance of talking more widely to businesses, to operators, and to residents in the areas you're dealing with. But the other thing is for everyone to really take on board that we are talking about lots of different types of freight operations. There isn't one size that fits all. It isn't all supermarket deliveries. It isn't all parcels going to households. It's the repairman with his mobile workshop coming. It's small shops who are running on a shoestring and whose profitability is very low. It's big shops. And there isn't one size which fits all, that it will depend very much on the area that you're talking about, but all the different types of activity really need to be considered as you go forward. Hope you all found that useful. Thank you all very much for attending and look forward to seeing you at another webinar in the future. Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.